What if some of Hollywood's most beloved golden era stars weren't nearly as sharp as their carefully crafted images suggested? For decades, studios worked tirelessly to sell audiences the idea that fame and intelligence went hand in hand. But behind the glamour, handlers quietly managed confusion, poor judgment, and basic misunderstandings. Halfway through this list, you'll hear stories so surprising they change how you see classic cinema. And by the end, one name may completely overturn what you thought you knew about Hollywood's golden illusion. Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield was marketed as the rare Hollywood fantasy, beauty paired with brilliance. Publicists frequently claimed she possessed a genius-level IQ and fluency in multiple languages. Photo spreads showed her reading philosophy books, reinforcing the image. Behind the scenes, however, colleagues described a very different reality. Crew members recalled Mansfield becoming confused by basic geography and everyday logistics. She reportedly asked why film studios couldn't simply move locations closer together to reduce travel. During press tours, journalists noted that she often misunderstood simple questions and struggled to follow conversations once they moved off script. Directors adapted by simplifying instructions and using visual cues rather than verbal explanations. Emotional direction was sometimes reduced to color-coded signals, sad, happy, angry, because abstract discussion failed to register. Mansfield memorized sophisticated words to appear knowledgeable, but frequently used them incorrectly, creating awkward silences in conversation. What made her situation tragic rather than comedic was sincerity. She genuinely believed she was presenting intelligence, unaware that others were quietly managing her limitations. Hollywood didn't correct the illusion, it protected it. Sonny Tufts. Sonny Tufts began his career with every advantage: education, good looks, and studio backing. On paper, he appeared destined for leading man success. In practice, he became known for chronic confusion and poor decision-making that frustrated everyone around him. Tufts reportedly arrived on incorrect sets, misunderstood schedules, and struggled to grasp basic professional expectations. Studio insiders recalled having to repeatedly explain where he was supposed to be and why. These weren't isolated incidents, they formed a pattern that made him unreliable. Public appearances became risky. Publicists quietly intervened to prevent unscripted remarks, fearing embarrassment. Even simple promotional tours required supervision. Directors reduced his dialogue and broke scenes into short segments to compensate for memory issues. Over time, Tufts became an industry punchline, not out of cruelty, but exhaustion. Studios eventually issued public apologies after his behavior caused repeated embarrassment. His decline wasn't sudden. It was the result of a career slowly collapsing under unmanaged limitations. Mamie Van Doren. Mamie Van Doren was one of many blonde bombshells introduced during Hollywood's search for the next Marilyn Monroe. Studios worked hard to present her as both glamorous and articulate. Behind the scenes, publicists faced constant anxiety. Van Doren struggled with basic historical facts and chronology. During interviews, she reportedly misplaced major world events by decades and argued confidently when corrected. Handlers learned to intervene quickly or redirect conversations before confusion became obvious. Eventually, studios implemented strict controls. Van Doren memorized a small set of approved responses for interviews, regardless of the question. This system limited damage, but also restricted her public presence. What made her case particularly sad was effort. She wanted to be taken seriously and tried to participate in intelligent conversation. Unfortunately, her attempts often produced confusion rather than clarity. Hollywood didn't educate her, it adjusted around her, prioritizing appearance over development. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was charismatic, attractive, and immensely successful. His intelligence, however, was often overstated by publicity materials. Directors noted that Curtis struggled with abstract concepts and deeper character analysis. Curtis reportedly believed acting was simply delivering lines with volume and confidence. Subtext, motivation, and nuance were difficult for him to grasp. When working on complex material, directors had to break scenes down word by word, explaining basic meanings that others understood instinctively. Despite this, Curtis delivered strong performances when guided carefully. His instincts occasionally compensated for analytical gaps. Producers learned to cast him in roles where charm mattered more than interpretation. Curtis's career demonstrates Hollywood's adaptability. Rather than confront limitations, the industry shaped roles to fit them successfully, but quietly. Tab Hunter. Tab Hunter was one of the most profitable teen idols of the 1950s. Studios protected his image meticulously, particularly during unscripted moments. Behind the scenes, Hunter struggled with memory, blocking, and basic production concepts. Crew members placed physical markers on sets to guide his movement. Hand signals replaced verbal direction. Dialogue coaches worked extensively to help him deliver lines in the correct order and emphasis. Press tours required detailed cue cards, reminding him which film he was promoting. Even then, interviews could derail quickly if questions became complex. Hunter wasn't unkind or arrogant, he was overwhelmed. Studios chose concealment over support, treating him as a product rather than a developing professional. George Raft. George Raft's career is remembered less for performance than for decisions he didn't make. He famously turned down roles that became cinematic landmarks, including Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon. Raft rejected scripts featuring flawed or vulnerable characters, unable to understand why audiences might connect with internal conflict. He preferred straightforward toughness, misunderstanding what made stories endure. Agents and executives tried to explain narrative depth, but Raft dismissed such ideas as unnecessary. He consistently chose smaller roles with limited impact, sacrificing long-term legacy. Raft wasn't incapable, but he lacked insight. Hollywood rewarded confidence until it collided with poor judgment. Linda Darnell. Linda Darnell's striking beauty made her one of 20th Century Fox's most valuable assets during the 1940s. On screen, she appeared poised and emotionally controlled, often cast opposite major leading men. Off-screen, however, colleagues quietly acknowledged that she struggled with reading and processing written material, a difficulty that complicated nearly every stage of production. Table reads were particularly challenging. Directors and script supervisors recalled that Darnell often lost her place, misread lines, or misunderstood dialogue entirely. Rather than confront the issue directly, studios adapted. Scenes were broken down line by line, with assistants reading dialogue aloud so she could repeat it phonetically. This slowed production significantly, but Fox considered it a necessary accommodation to preserve her star image. Writers were sometimes asked to reduce dialogue-heavy scenes, replacing them with visual reactions or physical acting. Darnell herself reportedly suggested such changes, framing them as creative choices rather than necessities. In her personal life, she avoided reading whenever possible and relied on others to summarize information. Studios never publicly acknowledged these struggles. Admitting them would have conflicted with the carefully constructed image of effortless sophistication. Darnell's career succeeded not because her challenges were addressed, but because the system quietly worked around them, prioritizing appearance over development. John Derek. John Derek's career represents a different kind of limitation, one rooted not in confusion, but in an extremely narrow understanding of filmmaking. As an actor, Derek relied primarily on his looks, rarely demonstrating interest in character depth or story structure. When he transitioned into directing, those limitations became impossible to hide. Crew members consistently recalled that Derek showed little interest in narrative coherence. Dialogue, pacing, and motivation were treated as obstacles rather than essential tools. His focus remained fixed on visual appeal, particularly the physical presentation of his leading actresses. Story concerns raised by writers or editors were often dismissed outright. Editing sessions revealed the depth of this misunderstanding. Derek selected takes based almost entirely on appearance, even when continuity or performance suffered. When editors attempted to explain narrative flow, he reportedly struggled to understand why visual beauty alone wasn't sufficient. Criticism genuinely puzzled him. Reviews that mentioned weak storytelling or incoherent structure seemed to confuse rather than instruct. Derek believed that attractive imagery was the entire purpose of cinema. His films ultimately became cautionary examples within the industry, proof that aesthetics without comprehension result in hollow work. Hollywood tolerated his approach for a time, but audiences eventually noticed what was missing. Jane Meadows. Jane Meadows maintained a steady career in film and television, but studio insiders noted that her confidence rarely extended beyond rehearsed environments. While capable when following scripts, she struggled during unscripted interviews or spontaneous discussions, often misunderstanding questions or losing her train of thought. Publicists quickly recognized the issue. Meadows' press appearances were tightly managed, with prepared talking points and carefully limited interview time. Any situation requiring improvisation was avoided whenever possible. This wasn't done out of malice, but risk management. Colleagues described Meadows as earnest, but easily overwhelmed by abstract or layered conversation. When discussions drifted beyond surface topics, confusion became apparent. Handlers learned to redirect smoothly before problems arose. Within structured settings, Meadows performed reliably. Studios ensured she was always operating within clear boundaries, allowing her career to continue without public embarrassment. The system worked efficiently, though it offered little opportunity for growth. Her success illustrates Hollywood's preference for control over development. Rather than helping performers expand their skills, studios often found it easier to restrict circumstances to match existing limitations. Victor Mature. Victor Mature projected authority and confidence on screen, qualities that made him a natural fit for heroic and commanding roles. Off-screen, however, directors frequently noted that his understanding of character and narrative rarely extended beyond the surface. Mature often misjudged scripts, focusing on physical action rather than motivation or emotional context. When asked about character depth, he reportedly struggled to articulate reasons beyond immediate goals. Subtlety and internal conflict were concepts that required repeated explanation. Directors adapted by simplifying instructions. Rather than discuss motivation, they focused on movement, posture, and tone. This approach worked well enough, especially in roles designed to emphasize strength and presence. Mature's career thrived because Hollywood cast him strategically. Scripts were chosen to minimize intellectual demands while maximizing visual impact. Supporting actors often carried the narrative complexity. He wasn't incapable, but he was limited. The industry responded pragmatically, shaping projects around what he could deliver reliably. Esther Williams. Esther Williams was disciplined, focused, and highly skilled within her athletic specialty. Her intelligence, however, was largely confined to that domain. Colleagues noted that outside swimming and performance routines, her reasoning could be shallow and overly simplistic. Publicists managed her interviews carefully, steering conversations toward training, discipline, and spectacle. Broader cultural or abstract topics were avoided. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Williams excelled when operating within clearly defined structures. Studios understood her strengths and avoided situations that required analysis or reflection beyond her experience. As a result, her public image remained consistent and positive. Hollywood didn't expect range. It expected reliability. Williams delivered that, and the system rewarded her accordingly. Alan Ladd. Alan Ladd's soft-spoken screen presence made him one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading men. But behind that calm exterior were persistent struggles with comprehension and decision-making that studio executives quietly managed for years. Ladd was not outwardly disruptive or chaotic. Instead, his limitations surfaced in subtler ways: difficulty understanding contracts, confusion over career strategy, and trouble grasping complex scripts. Studio handlers became deeply involved in nearly every aspect of his professional life. Agents and executives frequently stepped in to explain agreements multiple times, often simplifying language to ensure he understood the basics. Even then, final decisions were sometimes made on his behalf. Ladd trusted authority figures easily, a trait that left him vulnerable to unfavorable deals. On set, directors learned to limit dialogue complexity. Scripts were streamlined, with emotional nuance often carried by supporting actors rather than Ladd himself. Scenes requiring layered motivation were rewritten or reblocked to emphasize mood and presence instead of explanation. Ladd's success depended heavily on this protective framework. When management weakened or personal struggles interfered, confusion increased and productivity declined. His career didn't collapse because of a single failure, but because the system supporting him slowly eroded, revealing how dependent his success had always been on careful control. Gail Storm. Gail Storm was widely liked in Hollywood, known for her friendly demeanor and approachable screen persona. Audiences saw her as warm and confident, but colleagues noted that her ease rarely extended into complex or abstract discussion. During unscripted conversations, Storm often struggled to follow layered questions or maintain continuity in longer exchanges. Publicists quickly recognized the risk. Interviews were tightly structured, with approved topics and limited time frames. Storm performed best when conversations stayed within familiar territory work routines, light anecdotes, or straightforward, promotional material. Anything more demanding was quietly avoided. This careful management was not punitive, it was strategic. Studios understood that Storm thrived in predictable environments. On set, she followed direction reliably and delivered consistent performances when expectations were clear. Problems only arose when improvisation or interpretation was required. Hollywood chose containment over correction, rather than push Storm toward intellectual development. The system narrowed her exposure and refined her image. The result was a stable, long-running career built on charm and reliability. Storm's story illustrates how the studio era often valued smooth operation over growth. As long as audiences remained satisfied, deeper limitations were neither addressed nor acknowledged. Lex Barker. Lex Barker's career was shaped almost entirely around physical presence. Tall, athletic, and commanding, he became best known for roles that emphasized strength and movement, rather than dialogue or psychological depth. Studios recognized early that Barker was most effective when language was kept to a minimum. Directors avoided projects that required extended monologues or subtle emotional interpretation. Instead, Barker was cast in action-oriented roles where physicality carried the narrative. Dialogue was functional and brief, designed to move scenes forward without demanding analysis. This approach worked efficiently. Barker followed clear instructions well and delivered consistent performances when expectations were concrete. Problems emerged only when scripts required introspection or symbolic meaning, areas where he reportedly struggled. Hollywood responded by specializing him rather than challenging him. Career development focused on repetition rather than expansion. While this limited his range, it also preserved his marketability. Barker's success reflects a broader industry philosophy of the era. When limitations were identified, studios rarely attempted education or growth. Instead, they refined roles to match existing abilities, ensuring reliability even at the cost of artistic depth. Steve Cochran. Steve Cochran possessed intelligence and charisma, but both were frequently undermined by impulsive decision-making and a lack of long-term planning. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Cochran's challenges were not rooted in confusion, but in instability and poor judgment. Career choices were often reactive rather than strategic. He accepted roles without considering consequences, ignored professional advice, and frequently changed direction midstream. Agents and producers found him difficult to manage, not because he lacked talent, but because he resisted structure. Hollywood tolerated this behavior for years, hoping success would stabilize him. Instead, inconsistency grew. Projects stalled, relationships frayed, and opportunities diminished. Cochran's reputation shifted from promising to unreliable. His decline was gradual. No single incident ended his career. Rather, a series of unmanaged decisions accumulated over time. Without a support system strong enough to contain his impulses, the system eventually disengaged. Cochran's story serves as a reminder that intelligence without discipline can be just as limiting as confusion. In Hollywood's rigid machinery, Instability was tolerated only until it disrupted profit. Golden era Hollywood didn't require intelligence. It required obedience, appearance, and marketability. When stars struggled, the system adapted, concealed, and continued. These stories aren't about ridicule. They're about an industry powerful enough to rewrite reality itself. The illusion worked because audiences never saw the machinery behind it. And perhaps that was Hollywood's greatest performance of all.